Despite there being entire university departments devoted in one way or another to white privilege, the arguments for it are actually fairly simple. Once you move away from the purported experience, the claims of psychological hardship and the artistic and trance-like inductions to walk in the shoes of the oppressed, it's actually a fairly small set of mostly easily verifiable and falsifiable claims. Here I'll be talking about inheritance, education, and employment. Race and wealth inheritance. The Federal Reserve had a paper talking about race differences in wealth and inheritance, and there's some interesting data relevant to white privilege arguments here. One way to think about this is in terms of 8-hour days needed to work at $20 an hour to earn this inheritance. For anyone receiving no inheritance, which includes 77.1% of whites, to earn the median white inheritance, you would have to work 79 days. And another thing to keep in mind is that if you get any inheritance at all, you just got more inheritance than 77.1% of white people. But even when they get no inheritance, whites end up amassing much more wealth. We can look at mean and median wealth by race among those who got no inheritance. So even among those who receive zero inheritance, whites on average amass far more wealth than blacks and Hispanics. But keep in mind affirmative action. There is a great bonus in credential acquisition for being black and Hispanic. So here's a question. Would you rather have $10,000 or 250 extra SAT points? The smart ones of you will take the 250 SAT points, which is roughly what blacks get in affirmative action for being black. Hispanics getting something slightly less. The white privileged people will retort a few things on that, however. They will claim that hiring discrimination nullifies any benefit of affirmative action at the universities, and the white advantage in job quote-unquote connections will trump the effects of affirmative action, and that whites have an easier time financially getting that degree in the first place. Student debt and working through school. One argument that could be speculated is that whites get to just go to school, while blacks and Hispanics must face the hardship of working through school. Well, in actuality, whites are more likely to work both through high school and through college. I presented this data in a Facebook group where someone posted that black children didn't get the benefit of a good childhood because they have to help the family, when in reality, white kids work more. Humorously, there were several responses saying that this proves employer discrimination, i.e., if black minors are working more than white minors, that's because they have to, because of some system of oppression, while white minors are free to have their work-free childhoods. But if white minors end up working more than black minors, well, that's because employers are discriminating against black minors. So whatever the case may be, the brown people are put upon and deserve some sort of restitution. Yet despite all of this, white college graduates have basically the same amount of debt as black and Hispanic college graduates upon graduation. This may seem to contradict some other data you see saying that blacks and Hispanics have higher student loans on average, and this is true, but they are the same upon graduation, or very close to it. But the point is that even though whites are more likely to work through college, they end up roughly the same amount of student debt as blacks and Hispanics upon graduation, or at least the males do. In addition, there were not any significant differences between whites, blacks, and Hispanics in terms of how many of them got their parents to pay for their college. But what about grants and institutional money? Maybe whites get a bunch of free money for college. Well, the answer to that is a decisive no, looking at the distribution of grants and scholarships by race. By simply multiplying the average grant amount by the percentage receiving grants from the chart above, we can see how much each racial group gets on average for college. Once again, very minor race differences. So one can't honestly say that whites are at some tremendous financial advantage in college itself. Employer discrimination. Now, as argued elsewhere, due to affirmative action, it is perfectly rational for employers to discriminate against blacks and Hispanics given the same credential, and a link to that for the YouTube video will be in the description. This is because it is easier for blacks and Hispanics to get an elite institution degree, and with that elite institution degree, to then develop the work experience that an entry-level Harvard grad gets. That said, one thing that the white privilege pushers will argue is that non-whites get discriminated against in job application and don't get as many callbacks. And they will run stories about a woman who changed her name to sound more white and got 10 times as many callbacks, or other anecdotes showing similarly extreme effects. The actual experimental data is a bit more mundane, with the the white callback rates being from 0.946 to 1.506 times the black callback rate given identical applications. Not as exciting. So, regarding the stories of a name change to a whiter sounding name resulting in a tenfold increase in callbacks, as you may have heard, well, that may or may not have happened. Outliers do exist or could have been just completely made up for that story. Let's take 1.5 and say that whites are 1.5 times as likely as blacks to get a callback for a job application. Well, what does that mean in practical terms? It means that a black person has to send out 15 applications to get the same result as a white person who sends out 10 applications. A 50% higher callback rate seems like a big deal at first blush until you break it down and think about what it actually means in practical terms. It means a few more applications, but let me ask you this. Would you rather have a degree in sociology from Yale but have to send out 15 applications to get the same result as a white person with a sociology degree from Yale, sending out 10 applications? Or would you rather have that degree in sociology from Georgia Tech? Would you rather have to send out 5 more applications or go to a worse school? Or to put it more bluntly, the price you pay as a black person for getting to go to Yale when you're really only good enough to go to Georgia Tech is having to send out 5 more job applications than a white person with the same university degree combo would have to. A white person with a 1400 SAT doesn't get to go to Yale, which is to say it is utterly trivial. Maybe 2 extra hours of work. Maybe. Some may argue that I am trivializing the callback disparity. Of course I am, because it is indeed trivial. But even this isn't the end of the story. The study done by Agan Starr found that if employers knew about the applicant's criminal record, the race differences were reduced to practically zero. As an aside, the paper argues that the box, or the right of employers to demand criminal records, should be banned because it results in former criminals having a more difficult time getting jobs. But as it happens, asking for a criminal record appears to entirely eliminate the racial gap for non-criminals. The obvious white privilege retort, of course, is that the cops and courts are biased against blacks and Hispanics. But when I heard this, I thought about this infamous or famous cartoon that was spread around the internet on white privilege, and one of the panels was this. I was able to track down the study that this is based on. It's from 2003, and whites with a criminal record were 5% more likely to get hired than a black without one. However, they did not control for resume quality or credentials, i.e. the white applicants probably had better resumes across the board. As seen above, when blacks and whites have the same resume credentials and the same criminal or lack of criminal record, they get hired at almost exactly the same rates. Job networks and connections. The last real argument regarding employment would be networks, i.e. filling jobs via word-of-mouth networks. Who you know. When told that they benefit from this, I think most white people, probably around 77% of them, would say, "What the hell are you talking about?" But the biggest problem with the job networks argument is that there's no way to really measure its practical effects, to say how much white people benefit from this. And I think its unfalsifiability is the reason it's invoked a lot. However, we can look at incomes of first-generation immigrants to the United States, who presumably have fewer quote-unquote connections than non-immigrant populations on average. So first we can look at the median household income of ethnic groups and racial groups in the United States in 2013. And we can compare this to the median household income for first-generation immigrants to the United States. Just eyeballing the numbers, it doesn't look like US-born citizens earn more money than first-generation immigrants of similar origin. I compiled a list of these two groups for median household income in 2013. So we can see that immigration status doesn't seem to matter much. I put Asian in quotes because that could mean anything from Burmese to Indonesian to Japanese to Xinjiang. This is not a slam dunk against the work connections hypothesis, but it is certainly not what you would predict if work connections were really important. And besides, the people who push work connections never give any quantifiable argument as to its effects on racial disparities anyway. They'll just say something like, 85% of jobs are filled without an advertisement, but by word of mouth. Now, I have a personal experience of 2 chemical engineers I knew back in college. One went to go work for a company that his dad worked in, getting his job based on the connection and word of mouth. The other applied to 3 companies and got 2 offers. Fair enough, chemical engineers are incredibly high demand, but the one who had to apply for jobs ended up liking his job more and currently makes more money than the one who got his job via family connection. Of course, personal experience doesn't mean some sort of general truth, but I can point to anecdotes of connections not mattering. And I'm sure the white privileged people can point to examples they know of connections mattering. And from there, make the leap that white people are the beneficiaries of massive connections at a higher rate than blacks and Hispanics. But this is spurious, it's just storytelling. But what about the gaps? When you knock down circumstantial explanations for race differences in anything, the believer in biological equality between the races begins to get frustrated and will say, well, then why are there these gaps? Gaps in health, gaps in wealth, gaps in income, gaps in proportion of doctors and scientists and engineers, gaps in the proportion going to prison. Well, once you knock out a lot of non-genetic explanations for these things, what are you left with? If this is the first article or video that you are reading, well, there's obviously a long way to go. But let me be clear. I'm not saying that if these things were happening, that it would be somehow evil or wrong or in need of remedying. For example, employers discriminating in favor of whites is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Whites having more money and passing that on to their offspring, nothing wrong with that. And blacks are not entitled to any of that were it happening in a significant way. Or that blacks having more student debt upon graduation, I'm not saying that that would necessarily be unfair or nefarious. Or that there's something evil about whites looking out for each other and putting whites first and having white spaces and having white only spaces, a space for us, a space for our people, not for your people, for our people. Okay, it's a family business, and race is in a sense a broader yet shallower family. No group of people has any right to have access to whites. By arguing that these things are not happening, that there is in fact no white privilege, don't infer from that I have accepted the premise that some sort of major inequality is evil and must be fixed if it were happening. I do not believe that.